Hello and thank you for joining us as we talk about Ireland. My name is Jim Bruce, and in this episode I present clips from my recent interviews. Talk About Ireland is the home of long-form discussions with a wide range of public figures. Guests share their opinions and perspectives on the country, and these can be as diverse and varied as the guests themselves. Since the podcast began in January 2020, I have been lucky to meet 5 outstanding people from the worlds of politics, literature, music and filmmaking. Each guest has reflected on Ireland's recent past and speculated about what the future might hold for our country. I encourage you to download and listen to the full discussions. But here is a flavour of what each guest had to say. First of all, we hear from journalist and author John Waters. In this extract, he discusses national sovereignty and personal freedom.
This idea that World War II, Nazism and all this was something fundamentally to do with the essence of nationalism is a complete fallacy, it's a complete lie. And the whole impetus on the culture has been to essentially, as it were, as they would have it, to make us too small for our jackboots. But we never wore any jackboots in Ireland. No. The jackboots were entirely on our heads, on our faces.
Indeed.
And yet our nationalism, our patriotism is smeared with the same brush as German nationalism. And indeed now you have the extraordinary paradox where the Germans are demanding of other European countries that we step up and atone for their crimes. And when in fact we are uniquely in Europe, Ireland, were in the situation of the underdog at all times in history. And we have no leaders capable of speaking these simple words. Because I don't think there are many Irish people really in their heart of hearts who would not respond to that thought, that how unjust it is that the Irish nation has to basically fold its tent and crawl away because of something that Germany did. I remember actually being at a lunch a few years ago in Germany, and there were some French people there and some Germans and various other nationalities. But I had made a speech about the EU, which was in the immediate wake of the Troika being in Ireland, and it was pretty rough stuff now, as you can imagine. So there was a lot of, noses out of joint at the lunch, and not a lot of people talking in my direction, but somebody eventually piped up, that it needed to be understood by certain people, it was implicit, that the reason that the EU was so important was to ensure that the bloodshed that had occurred in Europe in the past did not recur. So I stood up and I says, I hear what you're saying, but let me be clear about this. Are you saying that in order for you Germans and you French not to start killing each other again, my daughter needs to go and live in Sydney for the rest of her life? Is that what you're saying? Because that's what's going to happen, arising of what's happened in our country now, as a result of the actions of the European Union, and the IMF and the World Bank. And I said, that is not a good deal. That you can't stop from killing each other, but we must pay the price. And not just the economic price, but a cultural, a familial, an intimate human price. I said, that's not acceptable. These are the things our leaders should be saying. You see, this is the extraordinary thing, Jim, that I have found myself. And it seems disproportionate in a way, in a lesser way, downwards disproportionate, rather than upwards disproportionate. That, in a certain sense, I mentioned Havel before. I mentioned the whole thing of Eastern European and communism and the Soviet thing. You would never have thought growing up in this country that such concepts might become relevant to Ireland. But now they have, in a very particular way. Not as grave, maybe yet, but they have the potential to become as grave. Because we have, in a certain way, the form of thinking which is now installing itself in order to protect the model that we have chosen, is such as to become tyrannical and to seek to colonise history and colonise the future and to discipline anybody who dares to dissent from that arrangement. And we see the signs of this already in Ireland now in the recent past, where we have a Minister for Justice musing in public about introducing hate speech laws, which is in order to compromise the right of people to open their mouths and utter what they feel. So I think we could be entering into a very dark period in Irish history at our own hands, which is an extraordinary thing. Or ostensibly at our own hands, although, there's no such thing in a way. I mean, the unfortunate thing about these new dependencies, and again I mentioned the EU and I mentioned the trans corporate sector, the unfortunate thing is that it creates a form of leadership which is very low grade, because essentially the great giants that once you might have expected to enter public life, there's nothing to attract them in. There's nothing attractive in becoming a messenger boy, is there? So they don't want to be. Michael Collins would not have wanted to be a messenger boy. Pádraig Pearse would not have wanted to be. He would not have been a messenger boy. He would not have been. He would have said, no, get out.
Diplomat and politician Martin Mansergh sketches out the international context for the Northern Ireland peace process, in which he played a prominent role.
I would regard the key period in my life, I was born in 1946, we're now talking in early 2020, was in the middle. In the sort of 98, 89, 90s. Now, if you look at what happened. The Iron Curtain fell.
Yes.
Germany was united. Now, remember, I had been posted to Bonn for 2.5. So I took, and still do, I read Der Spiegel every week, take a keen interest in Germany, as I do also in France, because I had a French research subject. And then you had the ending of apartheid in South Africa. And remember, the second country that Mandela came to when he was released in February 1990 was Ireland. I think the first one was it Sweden or Norway? One or other that's been very, very, very helpful. And we were the second country that he visited, because we'd had a very active Irish anti-apartheid movement. And then you see, and the message that those sent was, look, problems that we never expected to see solved in our lifetime, intractable problems like the division of Europe, the Iron Curtain, divided Germany, apartheid in South Africa, hey, they actually can be solved. They can be processed. And additionally, in the case of Europe, with the exception of Romania and, of course, the former Yugoslavia, which was not strictly speaking part of the Soviet empire, it was non-violent. I mean, the bicentenary of the French Revolution, you had a peaceful revolution despite vast arsenals of weapons on both sides. I mean, that was human progress. So in Ireland, people said, well, look, if they can do it to intractable problems. I mean, the pessimistic view is there are some problems to which there are no solutions. And people were beginning to say that about Ireland. And that the conflict would go on into there's an expert I knew who wrote a history of the IRA, it's several hundred pages, called J. Boyer Bell, he lived in New York. He published something in 1992. Now, he wasn't aware of what was going on under the surface. He saw it, as did many unionists, the conflict going on more or less indefinitely. The international influence was important. It was important.
That's what I want to ask you. How big a factor were these precedents?
Well, I think they showed it could be done, but then you see, and this was also important, the communist political and economic model effectively imploded, certainly in Europe. Now, I know you could say it's revived in China and so on, but I mean, that was certainly a great help in South Africa, because the ANC certainly was not going to be introduce an enforced communist regime, and I think that was probably one of the critical elements that allowed a breakthrough to take place there. The fact that the Soviet threat was imploding. Now, you see, you've got to remember, I mean, there've been quite a few minority political forces in Ireland that also saw kind of Marxist socialism as the way of the future, and including some in Sinn Féin, obviously in the Workers' Party, yes. and so on, and that was removed out of the equation. So you see, Brooke was then able to make his public statement that Britain has no selfish strategic, political, or economic interest in Northern Ireland, sort of to knock the idea that you could find in, say, defence papers in the late 40s and 50s is, Northern Ireland is vital to us, we can't let go of it, even if the people want, you see. So, but anyway, effectively, that Northern Ireland had ceased in the present day world to have any major strategic significance.
Defining Irish identity in a multicultural world is one of the themes I discussed with journalist and author Kevin Myers.
The question you ask is actually very important about how do you define Irishness, and what are the qualities of Irishness that make it special. Well, it's not all that special being Irish, but it is special to the Irish. And that's what is important. That's true for any identity. You create norms for that identity to express itself. And you agree on those norms, so the people in Ballymun, in working class area of Dublin, or Ballyfermot, will have a definition of Irishness that will be pretty much the same as a definition of Irishness in Connemara, in undeveloped rural areas of the very West. And this is based on a agreed history, on a perception of self, which it brings different people together with different accents, different religions, different classes. But it goes back to this thing that I referred to early on, ethnos, the Greek concept of ethnicity, which binds people together no matter how different they actually are. And I see no reason why one should deplore ethnos. Ethnos doesn't mean that you don't have outsiders. Ethnos means that outsiders come here with respect for the values that they find existing in this place, and they fit in, and they can fit in hugely and richly, bringing with what they have without, as I said before, I said 100 times, where would our food be without all these restaurants and
cabbage and potatoes and a bit of bacon on the side.
That's right. Now, I can look at the other direction, in the place where I was born, Leicester. When immigrants arrived in Leicester, the consequences were 100% virtuous. 100% virtuous. The shops, it seems incredible now, all shops in Leicester were closed on Sundays. All food shops were closed at 5 o'clock in the evening. The Pakistanis arrived and they simply ignored the laws, and they were opening shops almost 24 hours a day, and it was a liberation for the English people. But, the nature of immigration was, because it was uncontrolled, it transformed Leicester. Leicester could have benefited enormously from West Indian and Asian immigration, as long as it wasn't uncontrolled. And it's uncontrolled immigration is the socially transformative force which has brought great troubles for all of Europe, not just an Irish thing or an English thing, but all of Europe. And there isn't a European capital, or the indigenous residents of a European capital wouldn't look back on the last 30 years and not recognise grave errors were made. We have the opportunity to learn from those errors, and we're studiously avoiding doing so.
Singer-songwriter Johnny Duhan describes his experience as a member of a Catholic charity confronted with a difficult choice.
I approached the top brass there, and
in the Vincent de Paul.
I wrote to them, and I said, look, I can't go along with this, and I can't go along with gay marriage. I've written articles in the Independent about it.
Yes.
And I can't go along with the last referendum. And I said, how come you are not advising your, we're a Christian organisation, and they said we can't. We signed a contract with the government, so they give us funding. So if we advise our members to go against them, the funding will be cut.
Now this is, I wasn't aware of this. This is really interesting, because I can recall, as I'm sure you do yourself, back in the day when people would be out in the street with little boxes and flags collecting money for whatever charity they were collecting for. I don't recall there was any question of the government funding these organisations.
Yeah, I think this is a terrible development myself. Not only for them, but it's also had the knock-on effect of changing the organisation. I could be wrong about this, but you could check into it very easily. But I remember I used to always give Troker a certain amount of money every year, and for charity, Until one year I read an article and said that the boss here is making 140,000 a year. So I looked into it, and I discovered he was actually, that the top brass in all the charities are now on very high salaries, something like 135. So I wrote to a few of them, and I didn't like the answers I got. It was basically keep your nose out of it, and just if you want to stay with St. Vincent de Paul, stay with them and do your little bit or whatever.
So you've touched on a few things here which are really interesting. You've spoken about the Vincent de Paul, which is a Catholic organisation going back into the 19th century, or I don't know.
Going back centuries.
Yeah,
it started in France.
Vincent de Paul himself is a saint. Yeah. So this organisation, when you approached them to see what their stance was on the abortion referendum, and being a Catholic organisation, you assumed that they would be against the proposal to change the constitution, and not only would they be against it, they would actually campaign in some way.
Well, I thought they should campaign myself. I thought they should at least contact all their members and advise them, but that is something they cannot do.
And this is because they're bound by some legal contract with the government.
Yeah, that's it.
Gosh, I've learned something new today. That's really, really interesting.
I sent in my resignation anyway, and I said the reason I'm leaving is because you're sitting on the fence on these issues.
But do you think that the Vincent de Paul is somehow typical of organisations which have become in some way compromised by their relationship with the state or officialdom?
Yes, I do.
Does the church itself fall into that category?
I don't know about it. You see, that's what I said. I like to keep... The church for me is anybody who follows the man who started it. And that doesn't fall in line with... once you get out of line with that teaching, I can't stay with it, when they go against the very principles on which the religion was started.
Lastly, filmmaker Bob Quinn shares his perspective on the decline of the Roman Catholic Church in Ireland.
Yeah, well, the other thing I'm very interested in religion. I think human beings are religious people. Should I say not religious, but spiritual? We are spiritual creatures. We're way behind the time, because empirical scientists in the 19th century showed that there is no such thing as anything other than matter, materialism. Right. They proved that, and we didn't believe it because we didn't know about it, and we just caught up with it in the last 50 years that materialism is important. You have to make a living, and so we abandoned. The result of that was destroying the Catholic Church, which self-destructed. I left. Here's the irony. I was religious programs producer in RTE for 18 months, 2 years. And it was there I made most of my films. And my general point was, we are all handicapped. Some obviously, some less obviously, others imperceptibly, but we are all handicapped in the sense that none of us is perfect, right? Therefore, pay attention to the obviously handicapped, because we're talking about ourselves. But it was there that I started studying religion, I mean, I abandoned religion because I learned so much about it when I was a religious programs producer. I learned what it was about, something I knew nothing about. We weren't taught religion.
Were you talking about programs like RARC? I remember RARC from the 60s.
Wonderful, yeah. No,
Yeah.
I'm talking about the programs I made. I learned from those.
Okay.
But the RARC people had the idea as well. And they operated under the Vatican II. They knew the scene. Joe Dunn, great man.
Yes, I remember him.
And Jim Stack. They were terrific people, and they made terrific series quietly, beautifully, you know. And we all praised them and said, wonderful. But there was no philosophy in it. No philosophy in it. It was just showing something, you know. And that objectivity was something that was supposed to be the ideal. But I abandoned religion then. I abandoned religion, didn't have my children baptized, turned my back on it completely until the Catholic Church was destroyed in the last 20 years. And we learned all about this abuse. And I said, well, they had it coming to them, you know, because a hierarchy protecting itself. An organisation is a living thing, and the object is to protect the organisation, not to protect the people in it. It's like RTE. RTE is a living organism constituting cells called human beings who run it. And some of these cells are good, they're bacteria. Some of the bacteria are good, some of the bacteria are bad. And it's a constant struggle, but the bad bacteria win because of the influence of advertisers. Sorry if this is too abstruse, but a Jesuit said a thing to me once, about 10 years ago. He said, of course, you know that the church had to go because it was the glue, however imperfect, that held society together.
Now, are you saying that's a good thing or a bad thing, or do you regret the fact that the church foundered when it did?
Well, I think it was inevitable, you know. It was inevitable. It was a corrupt establishment. It was inevitable. And the only thing I have against it is it concealed the truth of the message, love thy neighbour, which was the only message worth telling. And it had concealed that. It said that there are just wars. There can be just wars. You can kill people in the name of justice, you know. We are the good guys, so we can kill people who are bad guys. And anyway, it was that kind of thinking that led me to but when I saw the glue, when I saw the society falling apart, which it has done, it has fallen apart, I said, that's the one thing that stupid old church did. It was a glue that gave people a sense of ethics. That was the only ethical part of our lives, that church.
Well, that's it for today. I would like to thank all my guests for sharing their thoughts and opinions. Talk About Ireland will now take a short break while the country figures out what happens next. But I hope the podcast will be back soon with a selection of new guests. Updates about this will be posted on my website, jpbruce.ie. Goodbye.